welkom op die slotmoment van de Triënnale. We hebben natuurlijk hier met enorme concurrentie te maken, omdat natuurlijk iedereen heel benieuwd is wat de toekomst van Brugge allemaal inhoudt. En wij hebben het hier te doen met een gelaagde toekomst, want we kijken ook voor een stuk terug en we kijken een stuk vooruit. En ik heb het grote genoegen aan mijn linkerkant gewoon collega Michel de Wilde voor te stellen. Voor die hem niet kennen, is dus verantwoordelijk voor cultuur bij het Cultuurcentrum in Brugge en dat ook niet eerst sinds gisteren. En op de rechterkant, de jonge man die naast mij zit, is mag ik zeggen, een monument in de conceptuele, een kunstenaar, een echte kunstenaar. En ook tegelijkertijd een monument in de wereld van de hedendaagse kunst, Lawrence Wiener. Dus warm welcome for Lawrence Wiener. He does speak Dutch, but probably better than me, and therefore I decided to do that in English. So a warm welcome from Mr. Wiener, and we are structuring the evening a little bit like that. Michel and I will sort of like introduce for those of you who are not too familiar with Lawrence's work, to situate his work a little bit to give you an idea about what he's been doing, and then we will move on to the central question, what is art in public space? And then we will look a little bit at the Triennale, and then we will eventually, if the time allows us, arrests us to allow questions from the podium, but we will also have the possibility to quickly after our podium discussion to have an informal talk. Yeah? So, Michel, I pass the word to you.
Thank you very much, Till. Lawrence, thank you again for being here. Our first question will be a very general question. As I told you, I'm a classic art historian, and the so-called conceptual art was high on our agenda. So could you bring us back, that's my first question, to the early days of your career, with pieces such as What is set upon the table sits upon the table, your development towards language pieces, and then also, if possible, give us a little bit of the taste of the general artistic climate in the United States at the end of the 60s, early 70s.
That is a stranger's request. For one thing, the most interesting part of it is that what you call what is set upon the table sits upon the table had no title for 35, 40 years. It was something that everybody knew of. It was reproduced. It was just a stone on the table. When I had an exhibition, I think it was retrospective at the Stedelijk Museum in 88, I titled it that. But what you're talking about, what's so interesting is I came in the midst of all of my working to talk about public art. What is public art? Not what is so-called conceptual art. Now, who the hell wants to spend a life with something that's called so-called? It's so-called such because it was called that not by the artists who were building the culture that we're living in, not by the artists who were making what they're doing, but by the people who were trying to figure out how to make an afdeling, a section that they could fit into with these artists, that they didn't quite get what was going to happen, but they had a funny feeling it was going to influence things. That is the tone and the tenor. The artists themselves, it came up recently at a panel in New York for the Xerox book. The artists did not consider themselves radical, especially in places like Belgium, where Wide Space was showing them, where the artists themselves were being gracious to each other. They were not radical. They were not distinct. They were artists of their own time, as opposed to trying to fit into being artists of another time. The gentleman and I had a talk this morning about that. You're not a radical when you do something that fits in your own time. You're not a radical when you like your daughter as much as you like your son. These things are considered special. The hell with that. I don't get it. I don't know what you want me to say. I was confronted with a configuration that I did not approve of as a young person. I wanted desperately to make art that, in fact, would set up a means and a manner for people to accept another logic towards art, that art was about the relationship of objects to objects in relation to human beings. The problem is that it's objects to objects before you get to the human beings. We were just talking about somebody and what happened to them. They thought they were a person. No, art is made for people, but it's made by human beings. It's like we weren't supposed to be talking about public art. Artists are part of the public. They take their kids to school. They take them to the dentist. They pay taxes. What is this? They decided to make art, though. And art is something that questions the logic structure of how you relate to everything that you find on the table. Hooray, it's a job. And it's a very interesting job, but it's not radical. And this concept of having to say concept art, could you answer me one question as a professor of so-called conceptual studies? Why were so many artists so supportive of some of us? They were not concept artists. They were sculptors and painters who had really good careers. It's the little people that came along that said, this is the end of painting. What's the end of painting? This is the end of sculpture. It wasn't the end of anything. They were just afraid that the pie was not going to be big enough to let them get what they wanted. And once that happened, what you call a movement screwed up, but the art didn't. And some of the artists continued to make things over the years that set into the life and built a structure and a logic that allowed things to change. That is the only prep I can give you of what it was like from when I entered in 1960, I guess. And what did I know of the world in 1960? I had hitchhiked to California from New York. I was 18 years old when I did the explosions in Mill Valley. And I realized recently, I was 22 years old when I had the big show of the propeller painters in New York City. I did know what I was doing, and I seemed to have gotten it right. But I had no concept other than the restrictions of my age and my experience of what was going on in the rest of the world.
When did you choose language as a sculptural form after these pieces like what is set up on the table?
I also made a series of paintings and things like that. I looked at it and they had reached the point that they could. I no longer could go as far as I wanted to go by using the conventional means which I had acquired, the skills of painting, sculpture, etc., and decided that with language, you've taken out that problem we were having of that everybody that comes to a sculpture thinks that that's the only way it could be. But all sculpture that's exciting, all painting that's exciting, is all because that's not the only way it could be. That's one of the ways it could be, not as it should be. And I began to see language taking out that whole Jesuital thing of the, when you get to the point of being where I am, you'll understand. Well, I didn't believe in my, and I still don't, that anybody has to get to any point that has to do with me to understand when I make a public sculpture, when I put something out, it's what it is. And one has to really take their responsibility, and language gives you that responsibility. Secondly, it allowed the use of materials without it being exotic. A stone is a stone, but a stone cut in Belgium, a stone cut in Ireland, a stone cut in the States looks a little different. In fact, they're all stones and they all sink when you put them in water. So why not just use the word stone in whatever language anybody understands what a stone is?
I think initially your language-based works were presented in book forms, and then you decided to work on gallery walls, site-specific, etc., etc. Can you tell us how this occurred and when?
The invitations came. Remember, you don't have a lot of choices when you're making work that doesn't seem to fit in. Books are perfect. I like books. Books are the one thing that any kind of repressive society never seems to be able to get rid of. Throughout the Second World War, all the books that they were burning, that they were destroying, somebody found another one in the toilet, somebody found another one under a bed. Books looked a pretty good way for me to present work. And then later it became obvious that people were inviting me to show it in other places, so I adapted the work to that. Okay, it's a legitimate, books are fine. If you're working with language, it's fine. If you're working with gesture, and remember gesture is a language. Remember painting is a language. And this nonsense about concept and that these artists are smarter than other. You can't make a painting without knowing what size it's going to be, stretching the canvas, buying the paint and mixing it. Now, if that's not concept, I don't know what is. Well, I don't know why we waste our time. Let's look at the things that people have made over the years. Let's look at their accomplishments instead of worrying about their classification.
Okay, but can I ask you anyhow a question about your statement? For example, the choice of interface, of typeface. I'm sorry, you've chosen a specific typeface. What can you tell us about this?
In the beginning, when I was using typewriter typeface and typing on cards, and then I wanted a sans serif. I don't like serif. I can't even give a political reason why I don't like serif, since I do like Philips and clothing and things. But I was confronted with what was I to use, and the only things available were Helvetica, which was fine for what it was, but it was authoritative. And I don't think that art requires authority. Art is just a representation. So in fact, I was using from the tobacconist and the stationery shop Franklin Gothic Extra Condensed, which came in a press type form. And it worked. After a while, anything that was being put up in the world in Franklin Gothic, because it is a nice typeface, people were thinking it was mine. Do you know what it's like to try to design a typeface? You have to have time, and time is the most expensive thing in the world. But I found the time. It took me a while, and I put together another typeface, which was Margaret Seaworthy Gothic. It seems to function very well for people. It seems to, non-authoritative, it has a certain elegance, which we should all have every morning, or else you don't bother to brush your teeth and go out the door. And it works. One day it won't work, and I'll try to buy the time to find another typeface. But to make an aesthetic judgment on it is silly. I remember once somebody who didn't like what I do saying, well, nobody would accept it except he got this flashy, classy typeface. Well, that's a great compliment, flashy, classy typeface. You went out and bought yourself a pair of jeans, and they were now flashy, classy. But in fact, all they were doing was containing the work itself.
If you look at your work, it's been almost a signature. The typeface became a signature of your work. You've been working for a couple of decades now, and 56 years. And what strikes me, I mean, these artworks are sort of on the walls. They are, sometimes reinstalled. I saw one in MoMA, and they have a wonderful timelessness about that. There is a timelessness about this typography, about these language, these sentences, these ideas that are sort of like projected on the wall. Now, also the new piece at the Whitney in the top floor, I think. There is a timeless statement to that typeface, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
No, the point is that art is made for its own time, and if you're lucky enough that it continues to function for each succeeding generation. But that gets back to this whole conversation about public art and public process and public things. Art should not have a metaphor. Art should really just be what it is. That's why Caspar David Friedrich is so interesting. You can see it, you can aspire to the romanticism, but it doesn't tell you what you have to believe in order to be in the picture. I try to make sculpture that when somebody comes across it, either in a museum or in a public space, they don't have to know a damn thing about me. They don't have to believe what I believe, because if they can relate to the logic that makes it art for them, they make a metaphor that suits their own needs and desires. It's my responsibility to make a work that does not allow for a racist, sexist metaphor or so. Fine. Everybody's got that problem with anything they do. But if you don't have a metaphor and you let other people use the work as it's supposed to be, I don't know if that even requires praise, because that is the point of the operation. That's what all art is supposed to be. And when you look at what market art is now, it's to suit the needs of whoever they think, whoever is making it, has what they want. Well, that's not the point. You can want what they want, but to make something that suits just the needs of those people who have what you want, you're in real problem. And maybe it'll last 6 months or 3 years, but then it's over. I would like to make art that when it's out in the street, it's on a manhole cover, it's someplace, 20 years from now somebody finds it, and they can still try to find their own place in the sun from it.
Well, that's interesting idea, but I remember a couple of works of you. I mean, the closest one is, of course, at the Herbert Foundation, which it's written on the wall. I think the first monumental piece I saw, consciously from you was at MACBA in Barcelona, and it was outside of the museum. It was on the square, and there was a lot of kids sort of like doing skating and all that, and kind of seemed to me that the atmosphere of that space was entirely changed because of the presence of that artwork. And we were talking about public art. It's an experience that we had here too during the Triennial, that just by placing a couple of objects, sort of in a very subtle way, the atmosphere changed and people apprehended the space in a very different way. What is your experience there? Sort of like,
isn't that the point? The point is that we live in a rarefied world sometimes. We forget that people are not stupid. You present something to them that's accessible to them, and it makes some logical sense. They'll use it in their lifestyle. So in Barcelona, the skateboarders all were making things out of a piece that was on a public library. It was on the bibliothèque. And why not? That's what it's there for. Many colored objects placed side by side to form a row of many colored objects. They began to realize, and I did talk to some young people there, they realized it was not a tautology. It was something. And in being something, they could use it for whatever it was they needed to justify their existence at the moment. Well, I don't know where the question was. No, I'm serious, Till. I'm serious. I don't mean to be funny.
Sort of like,
I don't know where the question is. You make art. Art's made by people for other people. And when it does function, one can only hope that for their children it'll function as well, as if it's going to be public.
Yeah. But that was a temporary.
That was temporary, but nobody, when they see public art, knows whether it's temporary or forever.
Unless
That's the thing with the Triennale. They see something, they don't know if they're going to have to live with it for the next 10 years until it falls apart.
Hopefully in Bruges not, eh?
Well, why do you say that? That sounds insulting to other artists.
No. We have
No, I'm sorry, I'm taking it that. What do you mean, hopefully not?
No. We have contracts with all the artists that all the pieces have to be removed. There have been some legal problems in the past with the work by Toyo Ito. That's why it's an inside joke.
Oh, I see. I understand. But it would be really nice if something went up in an exhibition and then the people who lived there said, ain't there some way we can keep it? And then
Generally,
somebody pull it together and buy it and keep it and maintain it. That would be nice. That's my idea of success.
and that happened.
More or less within a degree, yes, it has happened.
The other language, if I want, I think that's the wrong word. The other aspect that seems to become increasingly important in your work, and you have a little bracelet which I've been admiring the whole day, which consists of a artificial language, or rather sort of like gestures. So that there becomes like, you know, the type which is written in a specific way sort of recalls gestures, and it becomes like a non-verbal form of communication on top of the communication that is already there by the language.
Oh, I think what that was from the Hayward Gallery, from an exhibition that was given to the public. But I'd like to run with that, but I don't mean it to sound aggressive. But we live in a world that thinks that everything's in straight lines. Well, there's a large part of the world that doesn't read left to right, that reads right to left, and that sees gesture and line as language. And I try to incorporate the idea that primary, secondary, tertiary, first move, second move, third move, has a gesture, and it becomes a universally accepted gesture. Well, that's language. That would be like my saying, I did a public project in Amsterdam where people said that the language of the people from Suriname wasn't really a language, so they attacked the thing. And my only answer was, when in that language a mother says, I love you to a child, the child smiles. It's a language. It's good enough. And I just don't understand why artists would close off, because, again, they want to fit into some kind of an afdeling, some kind of a situation as something special. You don't have to be special, you just have to be goddamn fucking good at what you do. And you don't have to be special, you don't have to exclude. You can make it, you can be included without excluding. And yes, that's all, that's the answer about gesture. Now, I've learned so much from gesture, why can't I incorporate it into the language structure that I use to present my work? That's nice. It's a pity. I'm not a nice person, and I really don't think that the world we live in is terribly good. But there are positive aspects to some of the endeavor of artists, you know? There really are, here and there.
Lawrence, today we had a small talk about the relationship between art in public space and the social interventions that artists are more and more, but organizers await from or expect from artists that they get into social dimensions. And you had a very interesting reply. I mean, you were referring to your talk in Istanbul. Perhaps you can expand on this.
No, that's a problem that I have. Because of my privilege of being able to put work in public places and being able to show work, I can present logic structures. I can present things that change the way people see themselves in relation to the world. And obviously the world is not doing well. But what happened in Istanbul was, instead of presenting other means of thought, some people were presenting the horror that we're living in, the misery. And I looked at it, and it wasn't doing it well. And I realized that I was in a place at that moment where, when people did point out the misery, point out the problems of censorship, they got shot, they get killed, their children get mutilated, and they got put in jail in a very modern country. And I wanted to know why that was being done by people who really were saying something, And the people who are just saying, oh, this is awful, this is terrible, look at that, I talked to somebody, they end up in art fairs and the other people end up dead. It didn't seem to me that was a very radical thing to say. It was a curiosity of why does a journalist who shows exactly the same thing end up in prison, and why do they end up in an art fair? It was just a question. I don't know the answer. Okay, sorry about that.
No, that was a very interesting answer.
And it's a major question about sociological art. If you're not offering somebody a logic structure that's going to be able to change their entire life, the way they look at the world, what are you offering them? You're telling them, yes, we agree, this is a horrible situation. Well, if you didn't agree, you'd be a dreadful person. But if you do agree, what are you doing? You're just agreeing it's a horrible situation. Now I'm going to make 13 prints and you can buy 2 of them. What does that do? Why not make something that would give them a chance to be able to look differently at that piece of metal or that blood on the ground? Whatever it is. That's what art's about. Art is about those relationships of human beings to objects that you can change the essential awareness of. And none of us do all that well. But damn it, you're supposed to try.
Do you think that regimes are using art as a kind of, what do you call that, as a lubricant to be more oppressive, and so it becomes like a, what we call intellectualist Feigenblatt
They have traditionally, Till, from your expert, from the time of your expertise to now, they've always used it. But at the same time, the interesting thing about art is, and that's what I try to make work, that nobody could have it and tell somebody they have it without telling them what it is. And if I'm convinced that if they know what it is, it's going to help them find their own place in the sun, then okay, that's the best you can do. But as far as using art as a legitimacy and things, I don't think that's going to ever change, because there are people in power and they're in power. Hopefully that power will be changed at some given time, but God knows for what at this point.
It's obviously not the market who's changing that right
Excuse
now.
me?
It's obviously not the market who's changing that right now. If you look at, we had Song Dong here, who's one of the critical artists from China. You see the latest market report. It's sort of like at this point, I think there are more billionaires in China than in the Western world.
Well, what's a billionaire got to do with whether the art is talking about a relationship of people to the place that they're standing in? The hell difference does it make to you unless you can make a list and you can know that they can't, because if it's impossible to become a billionaire without exploiting other people, then you deal with the exploitation of other people, but that's not necessarily about the relationship of the object itself. I mean, seriously, remember, I have said this so many times, but there's a Jean-Paul Sartre situation. He was who he was, and he was supporting a newspaper called Humanité, and it was at that point a heavy left French newspaper during the times when it looked like there was going to be a social change. And his colleagues came to him and said, Jean-Paul, you can't do this. You're so famous. You're so established. Why are you out there selling this newspaper and pushing it? And he said, from 7 o'clock until 12 o'clock, I am perhaps the greatest literature that France has produced. Afterwards, je suis seulement un citoyen de la France. And that's maybe what we have to learn. You have to take the responsibility as a human being and take the responsibility in your profession for what you do. There is no reason why you can't be involved with Médecins Sans Frontières and still do orthodontry in the morning. There is no reason. I don't understand where this is all coming from. This is left over from the academy taking over art, going to a class that only does one thing, basically consume, which is middle, and they've thrown everybody else out of the academy. This is silly. Art is the last hope we have of people putting things into the world that are signposts of how we can relate to objects and we can relate to things. Why blow it just to make it comfortable for a lot of people who've had it comfortable anyhow? That's my answer. Sorry.
I will ask you a very basic question. I'm very curious about your artistic method. Let us suppose that you're invited into group exhibitions such as the Biennial in Istanbul. How do you start? Was the curator sending you a concept text, a thematic text, and then are you replying to this, or how do you function normally?
If I told you, you'd be so disappointed. Essentially, yes, I know the background of the show. I get involved. I'm a person. I talk to people. But for me, I'll look at the situation and try to find a material that interests me. And from that material, I'll build it up. And this was the Bosporus.
And you chose the site.
No, the sites were offered to me, and I chose the ones I would use.
And do you then analyze, for example, some historical or social aspects of that site, of that region?
Usually not. I know the social and I know the history. It's about what will work best to present what I finally first make. You have to remember, all of this placing of things for any artist is after you've made it. People come along and say, oh yes, do this, it's about that, and you do something for that. It might work for some artists, but it don't work for me. So there has to be a thing that has to find its place, and water finds its own level.
So
eventually.
Let's take Blenheim Palace. You have an enormous exhibition at this moment.
Yes, I do.
How did this come about? I mean, did you choose works for each space in advance?
Somebody invited me to do it. I went and looked at it, and I tried to put together a package of work that had to do with what it was in. You know, I'm an artist, so what I'm working on in the studio is what I'm working on. I had to put together a package that included what I was working on at the moment that related, what I thought was sitting on the shelf that related, what had been shown somewhere else. And I put together what I hoped was a show that had to do with a simultaneous reality that didn't have to have a conversation with the tchotchkes and all that were inside the palace. That was a simultaneous reality that when somebody walked in, they could have that palace tour, and at the same time, interspersed, there was another tour. And the surprising thing was that people did notice the difference. And that's all you can do. You're only one person, you know. And I know they love to talk about genius, but I'll be damned, I don't know what that is. No, I really don't. Art is absolutely perfect when it's done, if it works. And if it continues to still be useful a few years later, what luck.
I haven't seen the Blenheim show yet, I should say. Of course, it's a great non-royal palace.
Yeah, it's a non-royal palace, and on the side of it, explicitly, it states it was the breakdown of British male primogeniture. Right on the side, they wrote it down. Whoever popped out first gets this place, male or female. And it stopped an awful lot of people having to be poisoned, beheaded, or killed in order to get this property. But that was radical at the time. Now it doesn't sound terribly radical, does it? No, but it was at the time quite radical. So, and it's a non-royal palace, it's a regal palace. The guy got it because he beat somebody else for somebody. He went out, he protected, he got them something, and they gave it to him. And it's really rather amazing to be working in it. And the people were very nice that worked there. They were quite enthusiastic about the whole thing and about the palace itself. So it was not you don't have to reject your culture in order to be able to change what your attitude towards your culture is. You just have to leave behind the things that don't sort of seem right.
But this is actually an interesting point. We talked about that briefly earlier. Blenheim Castle is, something which only recently sort of picked up on contemporary art. I think this is one of the first really major shows that I'm becoming aware of. And I would assume that most people actually do visit it because they are either diehard Churchill fans, or they do love the park, or they want to see the architecture. So in other words, so there is this idea that Mr. Lawrence Wiener, born in South Bronx but living in New York, has a dimension to add that will, in one way or the other, be an added value to the average visitor. So in a way, it's a very similar situation to us. We have this, this beautiful city, which kind of comes over as diehard medieval, and people do come because they think that they can experience history. And at the same time, and this is, I think, where the triennial comes in, they are confronted with an extra level, and I'm very curious to see how people in Blenheim will react to that. I would, he said, I don't know why they invited me. I think I have a very good idea why they invited you, and I saw some of the sketches and I thought it's going to be absolutely fantastic to have this grandezza of suppressive architecture in one way, and sort of like the unbearable lightness of being, sort of written all over that, sort of, yeah. But so have you had reactions on how people saw the exhibition? It only opened Sunday, so there's
No,
not
but
too much
you
tweeting
remember,
yet.
I'm the last person to know. Most people living in the town, and all there's pictures of me all over. They're basically polite, and I'll be the last person they tell that they think it doesn't work or it does work. I don't know. And it wasn't done for a success level. It was done for putting together this simultaneous reality and seeing how people that didn't know what it was would react within the structure. I don't know. I do you do what you do and you do it as well as you can, but you basically have to say that you can't worry about the reaction before you do it, and if you do, then you're just setting up a reactionary situation. Then you're pointing fingers when you know damn well that the finger's going to bring about a reaction. What you do is you put something up that makes somebody feel absolutely useless and foolish because they're believing the wrong thing. It's a standard sort of situation. You don't attack something, you put something up that if you want to participate, you can no longer participate in what you were doing before. But you don't make it as a rule, you make it as a logic structure that they have no choice. If they want to be looking at the Mondrian, they literally can't believe in something else. They can't believe in another kind of thing. Well, that's what one tries to do as an artist. It's not, it's not a big deal. It's not easy, but it's not a big deal. But it's not easy to make shoes. No, I mean, life's not supposed to be that easy.
Lawrence, this brings me to the present triennial in Bruges. You visited the exhibition. How do you see contemporary art, site-specific art, in such an environment which is visited? Bruges is first and foremost visited for its visual appearance, as Till said, for this kind of middle-age feeling. Does it make sense that to put contemporary art in such an environment?
Well, you either can put it in that environment, you have to tell everybody that's living in their own times now that they don't belong here. I mean, it's a silly question, I'm sorry. Just the fact that it happens to be a particularly old city. I grew up in New York, which is an old city by Western standards. What are you supposed to do then? Say, we got an old city, now anybody that's here either live old or die. Doesn't make sense. Of course it's a place to put art. It's a place to put contemporary art.
That's a question we have had several times.
I don't see what the problem is. I don't even see it as a question. If you want to have art in the public, you want to make there's a difference between public art and a public exhibition. If you want to make a public exhibition in the city, where else are you supposed to do? What are you supposed to do? Make a fun fair outside Disneyland? What's wrong with it? These are human beings living at the same time within that structure. I don't understand. We waste so much time having conversations about nothing, and art is about its content. It's not about its context. The artist has very little to do with the context. It can't change it, but they sure as hell can do with the content. And if you can present something within the context of Bruges that changes the basic structure of people's thinking, then you've accomplished something. And that's it, you did it. And all those artists participated in it, and you all did it. What I don't know where the Klage afterwards, where it's all about.
Well, we're here to find out, of course. This is the final days of the Triennial. But a couple of years ago, I mean, we sat together, we met in Graz, yeah, and we were talking, we got acquainted, had a couple of drinks, and sort of like talked, and then, you know, a year later, you were here in Bruges, and the idea was sort of, let's see if we can do a work for public space together. And in a way, you met back then the Alderman for Culture, the back then director of the museums. You spent, I think, 2 days here. You were sort of in Antwerp doing the fantastic show at Muka at that point. You know, the walk with the British artist, and then you ended up with a concept that actually, to my surprise, in a way, was focused on this building. And you had this, the Laternentoren became sort of like the canvas, if to say. Or
I was excited. I thought that I could place something in the middle of this space.
We all were excited about that. It was, as I said, it was not the anticipation that everyone had that an artist like Lawrence Wiener would come to a town like Bruges and then picks the only building that is there that is sort of like really an architectural model. And I thought at that point we would propose that to the architect. He would be incredibly enthusiastic, but unfortunately he wasn't. And he said, yeah, can you do that not somewhere else? Does it have to be my building? And it was a work which called On Top of the Winds. And what happened to that?
Well, I waited for some time to see if it was they could figure out the problems that they had with the architecture, which was what they used as an excuse. There was no excuse. The architect did not want a tattoo or anything on his building. But what happened was he also got the tile structure screwed up, so they had to redo the whole building. But I waited to see if it was going to come in place, and then there was an opportunity that arose to show the work in, of all places, Jaffa, which is the Arab section of Tel Aviv. And we put it up, and it seemed to function very well. And it was fine. My disappointment of not being able to participate in what I had thought was for Bruges, it passes, I assure you. And here I am again. And God knows what it'll lead to.
I think it's time to open up to the public. Does anybody have a question for Lawrence, please?
My favorite part when everyone... Who's going to be first?
I don't know why I would have the answer to your questions, but if you had one, please ask. And if not, thank you so much for your attention.
Otherwise, we will ask you questions.
You ask the audience questions.
Could be.
Go on, ask them questions.
Well, there is, for example...
You brought it up. You know.
There's one of the artists here who has been participating, which is Daniel, who you met, who has put, I think, a very strong statement into public space, and maybe you want to say something about that, and then please do.
What is that? I have any question.
It's not working. Careful.
So I was not really prepared to ask you something. So what can I ask? I don't know. I'm also very involved in sociological things and the way the public react on things and participation and so on and so on. It goes a little bit a little bit another way as your work, because I want that the public really participate on the project. You know, it's like subjectivity thinking on subjectivity thinking. So it's like a perpetuum mobile, if you want. It's yes. So I don't have really a question. I just say what I do in this Triennale and compare to what you do. It's yes. I also work with words and questions and thinking and so on, but it's really different. So voilà.
No,
Maybe
voilà,
you have a
oui,
question.
oui,
Maybe you have a
c'est-
question to my
oui,
work.
oui,
I don't know.
Normalement, la présentation dans l'exposition, c'est seulement pour les réponses de le public.
Oui,
Oui, c'est une présentation, c'est pas une imposition.
oui.
Oui, c'est normal. Nous
tout à
sommes
fait.
complètement d'accord.
Tout à fait. Mais il y a une relation entre ton travail et mon travail d'un certain niveau, mais puis ça s'arrête, quoi. Hein, il y a ce sens de, comment je dirais, de participation du public, mais vraiment physique et mentale. Hein. Tandis que sur votre travail, c'est beaucoup plus mental. Donc, c'est une construction qui se met dans la tête des gens. Hein, chez moi, c'est une construction qui se met dans la tête des gens et qui est en fait une perpétuum mobile pour les autres gens. Parce que si on réagit, il y a d'autres gens qui réagissent et puis on continue à réagir, c'est ça. Voilà.
Oui, oui, exactement. C'est les différences de chacun pour tout et chacun pour soi.
Voilà.
Oui, et là, c'est chacun pour tout.
Chacun pour tout, voilà. On est d'accord. Merci. Alors voilà.
Anybody else?
Okay, so maybe we have now the time of. Do we have to do the performance now? Yeah, no, I'm not going to dance.
Taylor's going to
dance
in 7 sweaters.
7 sweaters. Anyway, so we have the time to now informally talk a little bit. Anyway, thank you very much for being here with us. Big round of applause for our